Hello, welcome back to my channel. This is Paulie Abides, and today I'd like to take a look at some frequency notes, just to talk about what frequencies we can use in a track and some observations I've made over the years about what's good and what's bad. I think what I'll do is I'll talk about what some usable frequency ranges are, whether that's in a club, someone's phone, your home monitors or speakers, or what frequency range can be cut to a dub plate. We'll talk about top end frequencies, how best to manage very high frequency content, and I'd like to talk about what the lowest note of your frequency should be, what your bass notes should be, and how best to ensure compatibility across all listening devices, across all endpoints. And then at the end I'll talk about what I call a preemptive pre-master. A pre-master is the file that you send to your mastering engineer, and what I've started to do is to predict what the engineer might do to my tune, and then based on what I think is going to happen, I'll make changes to my track so that it suits that person better, and what the end result is much better as well. Okay, so first of all, what I'd like to do is establish what some usable frequency ranges is, and we'll look at club first of all. And I've got the Function One website open here. Now, some of the best club experiences I've had have been where there is a Function One sound system in place. So we'll look at the bass end first of all, and the horn loaded bass are some of the most interesting products, and you might have seen some of these in clubs that you go to. So if we look at the product information, we can actually see what the frequency range is at the bottom. And for this device we've got 60 Hz to 250 Hz. So we can see that that is a really solid bass end loudspeaker. But if you think about that, if you're making a track with, say, a 30 Hz bass tone, that won't be represented well on this speaker. Or it might be, but it would just be a much more reduced volume. So that's the 115 starting at 60 Hz. If we look at the 215, again that starts at 60 Hz. The 315 is 60 Hz as well. Then we've got the dance stack, which is the low mid section. That starts at 90 Hz to 270 Hz, so that's your mid range. The 118 Mark II, that actually goes down to 50 Hz. We've got a Tool 218 here, 50 Hz as well, taking you up to 200 Hz, which is useful. The 121 starts at 40 Hz to 250, which is quite nice. 40 Hz to 250 again for this one. Again, very nice. The 124 actually starts at 35 Hz but only goes to 160 Hz. And then at the bottom here we got the 132, which is doing some really trouser wobbling bottom end at 25 Hz to 60 Hz, which is proper infra sound. That's really like not even necessarily audible. That would be useful for a festival. So separate from the low end, if we go back up to the products area again, we've got the dance stack, and in here we've got the low mids, which we looked at a 2nd ago. I think we've got 90 Hz to 270. And then we've got the high section, and that takes us from 200 Hertz to 18K. So if we were going to build a little sound system for our club, what you commonly see is actually what's represented in this image here. We've got the highs, the low mids, and then a bottom end piece. So if I get information about that, I'll take one of those. So we got 200 Hertz to 18K. Then the mids, is that what we just looked at? Yeah. So the highs we want now. Yeah, that was the highs. So we're good for highs. We've got to up to 18K. The mids, are 90 Hertz to 270 Hertz. And then we need to choose a bottom end piece. So if we go back to the horn loaded bass, this first one is what I see most commonly, and that's a 60 Hertz unit. So if I say F115, so if we were to set up a club and have two sets of these three items, we can go from 60 Hertz to 18K. So that would be our club frequency range. So if I say 60 Hertz to 18 kilohertz. Okay, so onto a mobile phone. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people listen to music just on a phone, on their phone speaker, like this, browsing social media, not even with headphones on. So if you're writing some music, you have to be probably aware of that. So what I try and do is try and maximize compatibility across all listening experiences. So what would a phone frequency range actually be? So I've googled typical mobile phone frequency range, and Google's handy AI overview thinks it starts around 150 to 300 Hertz and extends to 10 to 13 kilohertz, which is quite interesting. I would suspect it goes higher than that, as it's mentioned here. So if we be kind and say the phone that our listener is on starts at 150 Hertz, obviously they're not going to get any bass. They're going to get what we'll talk about in a minute, which will be the harmonics of the bass. And let's say it goes to 13 kilohertz. Okay, so phone monitors, or home monitors rather. So I've got the PreSonus Eris 3.5s, and they're only small little speakers, but they're quite handy for doing simple stuff. And that only starts at 80 Hertz, in fact. So I don't hear much bass, not any sub bass anyway. Not much bass at all. So 80 Hertz to 20 kilohertz. And dub plates. What frequencies could we theoretically cut to a dub plate? Well, again, the handy AI overview from Google reckons it's 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. But in other websites I've seen comments that too high frequency can cause distortion, but we'll put that in anyway. So we've got a workable frequency range here. So we're looking for a club experience of around 60 hertz as our starting frequency. We need to have content in the 80 hertz area for people at home listening, and for people on the phone we need to think about adding something that's above 150 hertz, and I'm talking about how to best represent bass here. Okay, so let's bear that in mind. So yeah, one of the next things I want to talk about is top end frequencies, and something I've noticed is that having too much very high end content in a track can actually make your song sound quite plasticky and computery. So what I've started to do is to reduce my top end frequencies as much as possible, or to a certain extent anyway. And how would that be done? Well, if I load up Reaper, I can show you the sort of process I would consider. So what I'll do is I'll start a new track. I've got span open here so we can look at the frequencies, and I'm going to put in a sampler and then find a hi-hat. So standard 808 hi-hat should be fine. That is a kick. Yeah, so an open hi-hat, if I drag that into a sampler, okay, so I'm just going to get rid of the Media Explorer. So I've got a hi-hat set up here. If I look at that in span, I can see that it's got high frequency content going right to the very top. And if I zoom in on that, we're only looking up to 20 kilohertz here. So if I put that up to say 25k, I can only actually manage up to 22. But what I have come across is that when you've got very high frequency stuff going on in the track like that, it can really make your tune sound quite plasticky and quite computery. So I've stopped doing that. And there's probably a couple of ways that you could reduce that content. And one of the obvious ways would just be to add a filter, an EQ rather. So if I was to add in an EQ, which would be a high cut, say like that, can start to reduce the high frequency content. And you can see now that the highest frequencies are not hitting 22 anymore. I'm down to around 20k. However, I've had to use a filter to do that. And there are other ways you can change the frequency of sound without having to use a high pass or low pass filter. Have you ever considered pitch as an alternative to that? For example, if I go back in, now this may not be suitable in every case, but if I take off the filter, we're back to where we were before. But if I start to change the pitch of the hi-hat, we're starting to get the same outcome. So I've gone down about an octave, and now we can see I'm actually down at 18k. There's 21k, and this key is 20k. Now, musically, a lower pitched hi-hat might not be suitable for your track, but you may want to consider using pitch to change a sound instead of using a high pass or low pass filter, because that way you don't have to use the filter in the track and you get the same outcome. So if it's musically suitable to have that instead of that, you're taking off that low end content without using a filter, just using pitch. Okay. So in terms of low notes, what would be the best and lowest notes to use? Well, we know that the club frequency, certainly from the sound system that we've just purchased, starts at 60 Hertz and goes to 18 kilohertz. So we're looking at a 60 Hertz low end. Now, I think those speakers can actually represent lower than 60 Hertz anyway, and certainly my monitors can. So if I was to generate a sine wave in Serum, which I've got loaded up here, I'll take you back into Reaper. There we've got Serum. So I'm zoomed right into the top, so in span, so I need to zoom right back out. So there's G at 96 Hertz. So let's go an octave lower. So that's actually, that's G1, and we're hitting 48 Hertz, and I can actually hear that on these PreSonus E5s, even though the spec said it couldn't be reproduced. Only very low though, it's quite a low sound. If I go down to 45 Hertz, which is F sharp, I think. Yeah. So between F sharp, G, A and B, these are probably the lowest notes I would consider hitting. So what is 60 Hertz? That's about B, isn't it? So yeah, those are kind of the lowest notes I'd consider using, between 45 and 60 Hertz, the absolute lowest. But how to ensure best compatibility across all devices? So the way I've started to look at that is through the use of harmonics. Now if I was to add, let's see now, Need to add that. Yeah, that's right. So we need to look at this in FabFilter Pro 4. So if I choose a low note, I'm hitting G there. Now that's not going to be necessarily heard on people's speakers and certainly not on a phone. So how do we best come up with a solution for that? Well, the way I choose to do it is through the use of harmonics. And I've got set up over here a distortion pedal going through Makie desk. So what I can actually do is send audio into that from here. So if I choose sends and add a new hardware output, I can send this sine wave to channel 3 on my desk, which has got an insert lead on it and a distortion pedal. Now I need to get rid of that hi-hat, and we need to make an input channel for this now. Now what you can hear is actually the raw sound of the distortion pedal on its own, which is just constantly outputting distortion. Okay. Now if I send something to that, what I'll do is I'll send Serum into the distortion pedal and not have it coming out anywhere else, so it's just through the distortion. Right, so I'll just reduce some of that volume a bit. So if I was making a sort of tech step drum and bass track, for example, this is the kind of sound I would likely be playing with. So it's just a sine wave going through that distortion pedal. Now that constant sound of distortion is getting in the way, so what I'll do is I'll use one of Reaper's own gate features. So if I search for gate, we've got rear gate. So Reaper's own internal plugins are all prefixed with rear. So we've got rear gate here. So let's use that. So now I can set the threshold so that all of the baseline distortion isn't coming through. Baseline meaning, the lower natural distortion. But when I play a bass note, that is allowed through. So now what we've got is harmonics occurring right up the frequency range. So I can use that. So if we say that right now we're looking at, that's G, let's go to F sharp in fact. So we've got a dot on F sharp, that's where the fundamental frequency is. Now if I was to say, let's see what a mobile phone sounds like. If I add that EQ to the input channel, so what did we say our mobile phone frequency range was? It was 150 Hz to 13 kHz. So if I add a low cut and give it a sharper curve, so 150 hertz is there. So I'm actually now playing the fundamental note and experiencing what it would be like on a mobile phone. So if I was to play that what the user is getting is not the bass note itself, but the higher harmonic of that note. So by giving the person the harmonic up, they don't actually get bass as such, but they're getting a perception of what the bass would be like. And if I actually cut off some top end as well, so when I compose the track, I might not have distortion going right the way up to the top. I'll filter the top off as well. So this is the sort of thing I'll capture off the desk. And then if I want to put some flair into this as well, what I might do is have say a kind of yeah, maybe a kind of notch filter. So I'll have the original bass line playing, but on top of it I'll have some sort of flair like that. So that could be heard on a mobile phone. If we're talking about a home monitor, that was 80 hertz. So that gets a bit more bass. And then, yeah, if I want to do a bit of a notch filter for some flair, I can do that. Okay, so if I add the original sound back in, which was over here, now we've got the original bass and the filtered bass or distorted bass playing at the same time. Yeah, so yeah, my first answer to how to ensure compatibility across all devices is just by adding harmonics, but it doesn't have to be distortion. You could use just another note within the synth itself. So if I go into Serum, so we can have a second oscillator. So if I stick another sound in, but have it an octave up, and reduce the volume, so now we've got a sound that covers more than one area. If I look at that again in Pro Q4, I'll take off the bass end for a minute. We've now got harmonics at, that's 112 hertz. We've got 236, and so on. Now 112 is a little bit too low for a mobile phone person. So if I actually increase the semitones by, say, 7, which I think is a fifth, we're now closer to 175 hertz. So that might be more interesting. Instead of having just crazy distorted bass, you can have your sub bass, but with a saw on top of it, separated by a fifth. And that way you're ensuring you've got someone able to hear something on any kind of speaker system, and you've got the sine wave for the club as well. Okay, so what's next? Yeah, so what I've been doing is what I call a preemptive pre-master. And like I said, it's trying to guess what the mastering engineer is going to do and making predictive changes before you send it off. And the reason I've done that is because I've had back some mastered tracks that sound unbelievably high frequency pushed. So if, for example, if I was to put on a high shelf, what it looks like has happened is the higher frequencies are being pushed, and actually the lower frequencies are dropped out as well. So if I do a low shelf, where are we? Yeah. When I've had a track back from the master, that would be a representation of how it sounds to me. The top ends are pushed and the low end is dropped. Now, actually having too much low end in your track is a problem, because the volume level can't be increased too high. If you've got too much low end content, it would just be cut out by the engineer to get the higher volume. And I believe that having the tops pushed gives a better perception of volume as well. So what I've started to do in my preemptive pre-master is to deliver a product which is more like that in advance. It's predicting what's going to happen. Now, I do that not necessarily by sticking a low pass filter over the entire track, but what I actually tend to do is just try and reduce the volume of the higher frequency elements like hi-hats, open hi-hats, maybe any drum breaks that have got quite high frequency content, and just be aware of that volume. Keep it lower than what you would expect, because when it gets to the mastering stage, you know it's going to be absolutely pushed on the higher frequency side. And also by having a lower, less in the top end, I believe gives you a better perception of bass. Now, you may not have it increased bass as such, but by having less high frequency content, you're giving a perception of more low end. So it's all about kind of perception, really. Yeah, okay, so that's it. Hopefully that was useful. I'm going to get on to making some tracks soon, but I just wanted to drop that frequency information video in. Yeah, hopefully that's useful. I think I'm going to get on to making some tracks in the next couple of days, probably starting with some breakbeat stuff. I should show you some sampling, how to actually set up a break within Reaper, and yeah, it'll be cool. Alright, so thanks for watching and catch you next time. Cheers.